Hey, I'm Brad from Fix This Build That. Today I'm going to show you how to make this logo sign backlit with LEDs. Pretty cool. The inspiration for this project came from Bob Claggett over at I Like to Make Stuff. I'm going to put a link down below for the video where he made a logo sign. Alright, let's check it out.
I started building the sign frame, which has two parts, an upper frame to hold the glass and a base frame for the LEDs and wiring. I cut the pieces for the base frame to 1.5 inches wide, and then I moved the fence and cut the upper frame pieces to 1.25 inches wide. Both of these dimensions can easily be altered if you wanted a deeper sign or a wider frame.
Okay, I got all the pieces cut. Let me show you how this thing's going to work. This is the base. These are the 1.5 inch pieces. I have them cut. I'm going to do miters on the end. There will be a rabbet on the back that will accept a back piece, 1/4 inch plywood. On the top of that, the glass is going to be held by 1.25 inch frame. All right, I'm going to jump back over to the table saw, do some cutting, and then we'll start assembling.
To cut the rabbets on the frame pieces, I used a dado blade set into a sacrificial fence. I raised the blade to 1/2 inch and I set the fence for a 1/4 inch cut. I designed it so that all 8 boards can actually be run through at this setting. This saves you on setup time and there's no confusion on the parts. Next, I cut the boards to final size with miters on each end. I started with the base pieces and I cut a miter on one end of all the boards. Then I flipped it over and registered against a stop block. The long sides are cut to 18 inches and the short sides are to 14 inches. I used the same technique for the upper frame parts. The difference here is that these pieces are cut standing on edge, so you'll need to adjust your stop block to get the right length.
All the miters are cut. Now I'm going to glue up the base, then I'll glue up the frame that's going to hold the glass.
I glued all the miters and clamped the frame together with a web clamp. These things are great for putting together frames. Then I used a machinist square to make sure that all my angles were 90 degrees, and I did the same thing with the upper frame after this one was dry. Before joining the two frames together, I made the cutouts for the on-off switch and the power supply in the base frame. I laid out a hole for the switch on the left side near the bottom. I drilled out the majority of the hole with a Forstner bit, and then I came back and squared the corners and cleaned up the sides with a chisel. I put the power supply input in the same corner as the switch, but on the bottom. You want these two close together to make wiring easy. I drilled a hole the size of the end of the connector. The base of the connector is wider than the end, so I used a chisel to remove the material until the connector was flush with the outside of the frame. The power switch I used was an on-off rocker. There were tabs on the sides for a different mounting application that I needed to remove. So I grabbed my Dremel tool and cut everything off until I had the smooth sides to fit in the opening I made. I test installed the switch and power connector and they fit great. If I did it again though, I'd cut these holes before I glued up the base, just to make it a little easier to work with. With all the pieces ready, I moved on to the final assembly of the frame. A good bead of glue and a handful of clamps is all you need here. If you have any misalignment, just get it as close as you can. We'll sand everything flush later. While the frame was drying, I started prepping the insert for the sign. I used a 16x12 sheet of glass and painted the front with black semi-gloss spray paint. I went ahead and sprayed 2 of them in case I had any issues with one. After that, it was time to laser. The lasering turned out awesome, and after some testing I realized that it would look even better if I put some white spray paint on the back. This gives it a better look when it's not lit, and it also diffuses the light when the light is on. While the spray paint set up, I went back to the frame. Some of the edges weren't quite flush, so I took it to the sander and flattened all the edges smooth there. This is a great tool to have for this kind of operation.
Alright, I got everything sanded up. This thing's looking great. I took it down to 220 grit. Now I'm going to put a little 3rd mineral spirits, 3rd BLO, and 3rd polyurethane on there. It's going to be a great finish.
With this finish, you just flood it onto the surface, let it sit for about 10 minutes, and then come back and wipe off the excess. Very easy finish to apply. With the finish done, I moved on to the electronics. I used a strip of white LEDs for the lights. They come in a 16-foot roll pre-wired on one end, and you can cut them to length in 2-inch increments. I'll have a link down below to the ones I used. I ran the lights around the frame to get an idea of how they lined up, and then I pushed the power switch in to start the wiring. To wire the power switch into the circuit, I cut 2 small pieces of wire. I know green is for ground, I just didn't have any red in the shop. I stripped the ends and crimped on terminal connectors to fit the power switch terminals. I used a wire nut to splice one of the wires onto the positive lead for the LEDs. Before making the final connections, I peeled the adhesive off the back of the LEDs and stuck them onto the lip where the top and the base frame meet. I used a few dabs of CA glue for good measure, and then I cut the lights to length at the end. To wire it up for a test run, I pushed the connectors onto the switch, and then I screwed in the positive and negative wires into the power connector. I hooked up the power adapter, and let there be light! With on-off capabilities, of course. I unscrewed the leads from the power connector and secured it into the frame with some hot glue. I wired everything back up and the electronics are all done.
I've got the glass that we lasered earlier. I got the white spray paint on the back there, so that's going to help diffuse the light from below. Go ahead and put this in now.
To hold the glass into place, I cut some 1/4-inch strips of walnuts from the frame offcut. I attached them with 3/4-inch pin nails into the frame. I flipped the sign over to take my first look at the glass in place. I love how that black contrast came out with the walnut. I was pretty happy with how this whole thing was turning out. The final step was to cut a 1/4-inch plywood back for the sign. I put it in place and secured it with 5/8 of an inch screws into the frame. Then I installed some hanger hardware onto the back for.
If you want more details about the build, there's going to be a link down in the description that'll take you to my blog post. It'll tell you all the things I used to make this, as well as have some plans there for you. Thanks a lot for hanging out, guys. I want to give a special thanks to my patrons over on Patreon, especially Sean Guthrie and Mike Nevitt. Thank you so much for contributing and supporting what I do. If you want to hit me up on Patreon and support what I do, you can go. There's a link down below as well. I'd also love to have you subscribe. Thanks a lot, and until next time, get out there and build something awesome.